So hello and welcome to the first in this year's CPC Connecting Generations webinar series. And getting us started is our speaker for today, Professor Yuliya Kosyakova. Yuliya is a professor of migration research at the Otto-Friedrich-University in Bamberg and the head of the Migration and International Labour Studies Research Department in the Institute of Employment Research. Yuliya's research interests cover the labour market and employment, migration and refugees, gender inequalities and the life course. And she's currently the co-PI of the German Research Foundation funded project, Migration and Integration of Ukrainian Refugees in Germany. And today she'll be presenting on the consequences of war for migration and settlement intentions, focusing on the case of Ukrainians. So I'll hand over to Yuliya now to get started whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Okay, do you see my slides?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, so I think it would be good if you, I will proceed. I think I have too many slides as always, and maybe if you have clarification questions, just interrupt me. I don't see you guys at the moment because of the sharing. So if you have questions, just start asking. The title of the presentation is a little bit different. So I decided to start with more general discussion of what I'm doing generally. So what I'm now focusing a lot is basically on this idea of sociology of conflict-related violence. And what I want is, or what I'm trying to understand is kind of the dynamics of migration and also return intentions in response to conflict in related violence. And here I focus on Ukrainians after the Russian invasion. So here is general overview of how I conceive in my research the topic of migration. So we have homeland and destination country, and there is a lot of movements. So people can migrate, they can stay, they can go to new country, they can return, they can move further. And there are a lot of factors shaping this process on the micro, meso, and macro level. And this, I don't have to tell you about the factors. Here are some examples. And basically, what I'm working at the moment and will show you is the role of this threat and security situation. So basically, today's focus is the role of conflict-related or conflict-induced violence. And this conflict-induced or related violence is happening in the homeland. And in the first part of my presentation, I want to show you a study where we look on the migration patterns. So when and how conflict-induced violence shapes migration from Ukraine in the course of the war. And in the second step, when people are in the destination, in this case in Germany, how conflict-related violence shapes the settlement intentions or return intentions. Okay, I start with the first project. It is a joint project with Irena Kogan from University of Mannheim and Frank van Tübingen from Utrecht University and Netherlands Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute. So here we look on the multidimensional effect of conflict-induced violence on forced migration decisions, or now we changed the title a little bit, so we now term it as wartime migration decisions. So this map shows you the situation of Russian invasion of Ukraine, several maps, and this kind of their first map starts here with the situation before the Russian invasion, and then you see there was a very rapid advance of Russian troops in the early course of the war in March 2022. So here you see basically northern, eastern, and southern part. There was a quick invasion. Then in summer 2022, Ukraine managed to regain some territories, particularly in the north and east, and then it stabilized in summer 2022. Why I show you only this first 6 months of the war is because this is a period on which we focus in this study. And the Russian invasion in Ukraine it generated one of the most largest displacements in Europe. Their estimates showed that in 2022, nearly 1/3 of Ukrainians were forced to flee their homes, with roughly 5.9 million people internally displaced, like majority of them women and children, and nearly 5.7 million refugees and asylum seekers from Ukraine were recorded across Europe by the end of 2022. Okay, so what we do and what is our contribution is in this specific project is that we know that there is a link between conflict and outmigration. And here we basically focus on so we examine to what extent migration patterns of Ukrainians in the days and months directly following the Russian invasion are influenced by the conflict intensity or violence intensity, violence proximity, and the type of what we call conflict-induced violence. We also look on the heterogeneous responses to conflict-induced violence by key social demographic characteristics. And we also look where people go, so whether they are internally displaced in response to conflict-induced violence or they go abroad. Theoretically, we operationalize with aspiration capabilities theoretical framework and derive a series of hypotheses from this framework. But I will not show you the whole theory. I will show you the results and then explain them in terms of this framework. So our data. We rely on the online survey of Ukrainians. This is project together with Irena Frank and Stefan Perchki from GESIS. So what we did here, we generated a sample via Meta platform. So we posted advertisement on Facebook, Instagram, and Messenger, invited people to participate, and then they were like, they went to a separate website, to another website to fill our questionnaire. Our target population was people with Ukrainian citizenship, age 18 plus, who lived in Ukraine on 23rd February 2022. So at least one day before the war outbreak, they had to reside in Ukraine. We showed advertisement, or advertisement was shown to people who stated Ukrainian or Russian as their language, and those who lived in Ukraine, and then in 8 European countries. So our idea was to capture not only those who left Ukraine, but also those who stayed in Ukraine and then were either resettled, were either moving within Ukraine or stayed in their initial residence place. We also used snowball sampling, and our survey was online between 14th of July until 13th of August 2022. Our population, our sample included, after some cleaning, roughly 42,000 individuals. And of course, we have all the issues and challenges related to social media participation. So we have non-probability sampling. There are potential sampling and selection bias, particularly for those in strongly affected areas. But at the same time, it's only one way to sample people with similar sample frame across different countries and with the same questionnaire, etc. So there are and we are aware about potential biases, but there are a lot of advantages of this sampling way. Okay, so what we do, we keep only in our analysis, we consider only women, because on the one hand, men have very selective participation in social media because of the war. I mean, they are mobilized, they are in the war, and they are not allowed, even those in the war, they are not allowed to use media, but generally there are some selectivity in their social media usage. And then, of course, because men were prohibited to leave Ukraine, or at least men in conscription age, so that's why, I mean, we decided not to consider them in this analysis. So our sample includes so-called women who are at risk to leave Ukraine since 24th of February, since the beginning of the war. It means that we exclude everybody who reported not to leave one day before the war in Ukraine. We excluded men, we excluded Crimea and Sevastopol respondents, and our final sample included 24,000 people. And then we transformed this to a so-called day person format. So we observe person in her first, like on the 24th of February, and then the person exits the sample, the data when the person left the pre-war residence place or is so-called censored, meaning by the date of the interview, stayed in the same place. Our dependent variable is a hazard rate of leaving the pre-war residence place, means, so this is basically the daily probability to leave this pre-war residence place, conditional on the fact that it was not left by the specific day. This leaving event occurred for 17 and slightly less than 17 and a half in individuals, and then for those who have not left, there is this event is coded as 0 for those who have not left the pre-war residence. And for our analysis, we rely on Cox proportional hazard regression. How we measure conflict intensity. We used a lot of so-called big data. So we have basically time-varying data on war-related events in Ukrainian counties. So our geographical unit is county or oblast. We use here data from Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. So here we have the number of fatalities, violent events against civilians, explosion, remote violence, and battles. Then we use statistics of air alarms in Ukraine. So we have daily information on duration of alarms for each oblast or each county. Then we also consider statistics on civilian infrastructure that was destroyed or damaged in the course of the war. And here we can distinguish between critical infrastructure, logistic and communication infrastructure, and other infrastructure. And finally, we consider the share of the county's territory occupied by the enemy forces. And this was web scraped from the LiveUA map. So basically, each of these indices or data is available for every day since the war outbreak for each oblast level. What we did with all this data, we standardized each of these macro indicators and then created a mean index and then re-standardized again. And then we merged to this individual person day data. In this sense, our conflict intensity index is time-varying. And we considered basically what happened cumulatively for 2 days in the last residence country before each day or in our large data set. Okay, this is how our conflict intensity index looks in the data. So this is a kind of aggregated information between 24th of February till August 13, the last day of our participation in the survey. And you see it's closely follows the map, what I showed you before, with much of violence happening here in the eastern Ukraine and also in southern Ukraine, but also in Kiev Oblast, because it was very much affected, particularly in the first days of the war. And here are the first results. So just some descriptive analysis. This is a Kaplan-Meier estimates, and it shows basically the transition rate or the hazard of leaving their pre-war residence. And we see, for example, here, 30 days after the war outbreak, 60% of our sample left their pre-war residence date. These results are very different if we look on the regional differences. So you can see here, for example, the red line is for Kiev city. We see that this leaving rate was much stronger for Kiev, meaning that people left Kiev much earlier than it was, for example, in the western part of Ukraine, the blue line. Very interesting, I think, is the patterns for southern Ukraine. So you see that at the beginning it was slower rate, but then it accelerated after the 6 days. So it is also later when the southern part of Ukraine was strongly affected. Okay, and now I move to the main results. So here the first result from our model. We model here the role of this conflict-induced violence and intensity of this conflict-induced violence, controlling for a lot of individual level characteristics. And what we see here is that with growing threat of conflict-induced violence, or basically with growing intensity of this index, we observe increased hazard of forced migration, yet the effect is not non-linear, and we observe a gradual diminishment of the positive effect of the CIV index, and this becomes potentially negative under extreme conditions. So, I mean, this is very rare that these extreme conditions are happening on this oblast level, but there are still this very negative effect. And this could be explained in terms of this aspiration capabilities framework, where within motivation to flee increases in the face of life-threatening violence, but at the same time, the cost of moving are also increasing. So basically the capability of fleeing reduces and constrains person to leave because of destruction of the communication and logistics, for example, due to the war. At the same time, another explanation could be a so-called adaptation phenomena that with prolonged exposure to conflict and repeated instances of violence, there is the threshold increases and to leave, and requires even more violence to trigger these intentions to leave. But as I will show you later, we would say it's not adaptation, it's rather the lacking capabilities to leave. Okay, next we look on the proximity of this conflict-induced threat, and here we considered what is happening in my own country, so as in previous graph, but then we also considered neighboring county and non-neighboring county. And here you can see that the kind of special proximity is critical in shaping migration decision. And the migration is mostly pronounced when threat is immediate, basically in own county. It diminishes with for neighboring regions, and the lowest is when it is happening in distant regions. But at the same time, you see that here is increasing rate later on, meaning that in extreme conditions, even if something happening in non-neighboring countries, people might respond with migration. So basically it says something about this anticipatory nature of migration, where individuals not only respond to the very proximate violence, but also proactively anticipate potential threat, particularly from neighboring areas. Next, we distinguish between type of conflict-induced violence, and here we looked on this direct violence, indirect, and forewarning direct violence. So direct, it is, for example, the considers the number of fatalities. Indirect, it's, for example, explosions, and then forewarning, it's alarms. And we expected that people will stronger respond to direct violence, less to indirect, and then least to forewarning violence. But then we see here completely different patterns, with forewarning violence having the strongest impact on their migration. So people basically quickly respond to these alarms and leave the affected areas. Okay, I do not show you all the tables here and results, but we then looked on the specific indicators. So each of the indicators of this larger conflict index. And then what we observed is that migration rate increases in case of destruction of critical infrastructure, duration of alarms, number of explosions, battles, and war-induced fatalities. But migration rate decreases when the area occupied by enemy forces increases, when the logistic and communication routes are damaged, and also when there is a direct violence against civilians, for example, something like what happened in Bucha. And considering this non-linearity effect, so that's why we say it's not adaptation, it's rather this lack of capabilities, because if you look what are the barriers, like occupied area or obliteration of logistic and communication routes, it means that it is rather diminished capabilities of civilians to leave areas strongly affected by conflict-induced violence, rather than increased resilience or adaptation. Okay, then when we look by vulnerability, so by social demographic groups, what we found, or generally our data shows that traditionally vulnerable groups like elderly or mothers of large families, they have lower propensity to leave, but we interacted this with conflict-induced violence, and we observed their increased response to conflict-induced violence, which means that basically it pushes them out, maybe due to evacuation, and it might reduce the gap in displacement due to this vulnerability. So basically for vulnerable strata, conflict-induced violence becomes additional catalyst to leave these affected areas, and it kind of equalizes migration propensity. We look then also by so-called productivity potential. So the idea was here that usually we know that people with more education or more financial resources, they have better or higher propensity to migrate. And here we expected them also to be more responsive to conflict-induced violence. But we didn't find any significant interactions effects, meaning that this group of people, they continue have faster or larger or higher propensity of leaving independent of conflict-induced violence. So basically their inequality in this escape opportunity endures. And finally, we looked on where people go in response to increased violence. And we observed that people rather move within Ukraine or faster within Ukraine rather than internationally. It is partly in contrast to the previous research, which showed that people relocate to larger distance with higher levels of violence. But in our case, we see that resettling within country seems to be more viable option in response to conflict-induced violence threat. Probably it reflects a notion of home bias that shapes individuals' decision making in a face of increased violence, leading them to seek safety haven within the borders of their home state. However, it is important to stress that we look on the very initial phase of the war, during which many Ukrainians still held beliefs in the quick end of the hostilities and returning home. It might be that over time, over longer duration of war and intensification on conflict-induced violence, the patterns of destination choice change. So to sum up, individuals respond to threat that arise with intensity of conflict-induced violence in surrounding areas by immigration. We showed non-linearity of conflict-induced violence, which emphasizes basically the urgent need for additional support to severely affected areas. Not shown today. I showed you today that response is particularly strong in case of violence forewarning, followed by indirect threat, and direct threat seems to be basically restricts possibility of out-migration. And if threat occurs in more distant areas, individuals react by reduced propensity of out-migration. We observed that vulnerable groups react stronger to conflict intensity. At the same time, we do not see greater response of conflict intensity for individuals with higher productivity levels. And people rather respond to conflict-induced violence by resettling in comparably safer regions within the home country instead of international migration, stressing the need to support of IDPs. In this sense, some of our findings support previous research, other findings challenge existing theoretical arguments and empirical evidence, meaning that there are some universal effects of conflict-induced violence, while others may be very context-specific. I move to the second part of my talk, where here we now move to destination countries, and here specifically to German context. Here we looked on the role of what is happening home, this conflict intensity at home, and settlement intentions of Ukrainian refugees abroad. And this is very important because, I mean, the conflict is still ongoing. There is a lot of uncertainties around, and given the necessity to integrate people, I mean, where it is already more than 2 years, and it is very important to understand how the conflict plays a role when people already far away. So there is a little research connection between military conflict in one's own country or region and the intentions of refugees to stay or return. Previous research more focused on hypothetical scenarios, on the return considerations of refugees, and on connection between the desire to return and individual experience of violence or perceived situation in the country. So our research questions here are all refugees equally affected by intensity of conflict in their homeland? Then do military events in the home region accumulate over time and influence refugees' trust in a return to one peaceful homeland? Or are there more immediate effects of the deteriorating security situation in the homeland on the decision to return? So why should conflict intensity matter for settlement intentions in destination or international destination? So this higher intensity of conflict is likely to correlate with stronger settlement intentions, because refugees may perceive higher conflict intensity as indicator for long-term reduced security situation. They can also perceive longer-term economic and social living conditions as worse at home due to the destruction of infrastructure. They might also suffer from anxiety and stress, particularly due to worries about family members or friends left behind. And this could promote reduced mental health and well-being. And also, conflict intensity could be perceived as an amplification of political regime that refugees disapprove. We can imagine that there could be a short or long-term effect of conflict-related violence. For example, increased conflict intensity can be seen as a shock to location preferences. For example, some news about recent conflict dynamics may signal long-term security risk, worsen economic and social conditions, increase anxiety and stress level, and then this could increase attractiveness of the host country compared to the home country. But there are also possibility of long-lasting effect because of reduced hope to return. There is a destruction of housing, lack of basic facilities, infrastructure, generally poor economic prospects in war-affected countries. There could be an adaptation to permanent conflict intensity, increased resilience, which could increase intentions to settle abroad. So what we do is here we look on the settlement and return intentions. So basically moving from a host country to one's home country with no immediate plans to depart again. And this is rather planned behavior than observed behavior, but the previous research also stresses that in many cases, observed behavior requires planned behavior before, and this is also a very good indicator. So the planned behavior correlates a lot with observed behavior. We rely on the representative longitudinal data from the IRB BIP-FREDA-BAMP survey of Ukrainian refugees in Germany. The data includes roughly 11,000 of refugees from Ukraine, and it was conducted in 2 waves. First wave was conducted between August and October 2022, so 6 months after the war outbreak. And second wave was conducted 6 months later, or slightly less, between January and March 2023. For conflict intensity, we look only on the data from Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, and we consider cumulative number of fatalities in the last residence country. To define short-term effect, we look on the cumulative number of fatalities in the 3 days before survey completion. For the long-term effect, and here is important, in the respondents oblast, origin oblast in Ukraine. For the long-term effect, we consider cumulative fatalities since the war outbreak until the survey completion date in the respondents' origin oblast. So here, just to show you what is happening in the data, so it shows you the number of observations during the survey period, and then this blue line shows the fatalities. So this is basically the distribution in the first wave and in the second wave. You see that in the second wave, the fatalities, number of fatalities is jumping and increasing, but there is no strong correlation between interview participation patterns or rates and daily interview participations and conflict intensity in origin. I start with overall observation on settlement intentions of Ukrainian refugees in Germany. You see here this they are very dynamic. There are on the one hand, there are some dynamics. On the other hand, there is a lot of stability between 2 observation periods. So between August, October 2022 and January, March 2023. So in most cases, intentions remained relatively stable. So those who wanted to settle forever in Germany, they continue say that they want to settle forever. There are stability in returns, but there is also a large share of people who were uncertain in the first wave of this survey, so they didn't know whether they want to stay or return. There was a question? Okay. But then at the same time, we see that there are, by the second survey period, this uncertainty regarding intentions decreased, and this is particularly due to increased intentions to stay in Germany, but also some intentions to return increased. And here also immediately the results from the multivariate analysis. So I show you the effect on the short-term effect and long-term effect of cumulative fatalities on the overall settlement intentions. And then when we separate this certain stay versus certain return and certain stay versus uncertainty. So we try to incorporate this uncertainty of decision. And for interpretation, you can see, I mean, this is a standardized index. It means that 100 additional fatalities in the last residence county 3 days before the interview corresponds to an increase in settlement intentions by almost 5 percentage points. This effect is slightly stronger if you consider certain stay versus certain return, and also a little bit increased when you consider this certain stay versus uncertainty. If you consider long-term effect, the effect is very small. However, there is significantly more fatalities on average since the war began. We looked on the also here. We looked on the heterogeneity of the conflict of the fatalities effect by gender, because men have higher risks than women to return to Ukraine due to military service. So we expected men to be more responsive to the conflict intensity, particularly in the short-term dynamics, and this hypothesis was supported. So men are more likely to respond with stronger settlement intentions if something happening at home. We also looked on the people with family members left behind. Here, what the mechanism based on these emotional attachments or responsibility for victims, and we expected reduced intentions to stay. So basically, we expected that lower conflict intensity effect. We expected lower conflict intensity effect on intentions to stay for those refugees with family members left behind, and this hypothesis was supported. So they are less affected by conflict intensity. They generally want to return. And then we expected some variation by motives for migration. So the idea was that people who left for reasons beyond purely humanitarian, so those who told that, for example, also economic opportunities or family in Germany were important drivers to choice of Germany as a destination. We expected them to be less responsive to the CEF, and this hypothesis was not supported, so they were more responsive to what is happening at home. And then for longer term we expected increased intentions to stay with long-term conflict intensity events, because they left for different reasons or purely humanitarian, and then due to this infrastructure destruction, economic opportunities destruction, they should be have fewer incentives to return, particularly when there is a long-term destruction, and this hypothesis was supported. So the take-home message is that conflict intensity in home regions shapes refugee settlement intentions. And this is particularly true for certainty of such intentions. So we see that the effect becomes stronger when settlement intentions uncertainty is accounted for. Yet the effect seems to be rather short-lived than long-lasting, meaning that it's more emotional, probably more emotional reaction than planned behavior. And this emotional reaction might be that it will not continue longer. So it will not endure. Maybe after some time, people come back to their initial settlement intentions. But we also observed a lot of heterogeneity in reactions to the conflict intensity. Refugees' intentions seems to be particularly reactive to this short-term military conflict dynamics. And basically it's emotional responses to daily stresses and immediate reports. They can disrupt more rationally calculated intentions. And why it is important is that settlement intentions are closely connected to a specific behavior that drives social or economic integration of refugees. So for example, if people want to stay forever, they invest differently in their important resources for their integration. And basically, settlement intentions is one of the major predictors of future integration. And here, what is happening at home can really disrupt this intention or shape these intentions. Which means that there is kind of necessity to support people and consider their varying needs of refugee population. Okay, and probably something to say at the end. What drives my curiosity and passion is that myself, I come from Ukraine. I arrived to Germany in 2002. And I was one of those, I was involuntary mover. I was a tight mover. I arrived as Jewish quarter refugee. I didn't have knowledge of German. I had a lot of obstacles in the integration process. I had a lot of family members and friends left behind. And then 20 years later, I experienced this Russia's attack on Ukraine. I experienced flight of my sister and her children to Germany. So the whole process of this integration and obstacles restarted again. And then, when I work with this data, with this beautiful world of the data, I have the hypothesis, how this conflict intensity can shape individuals' migration patterns or their settlement intentions. And then I'm happy that some hypothesis supported. I'm very excited researcher. And then I realized that it's real stories and it's real life situations. And these people share with us probably with this data about their life. And I think it is very important for us to keep in mind that behind all of this data, there's real life, real stories, and real life situations. It's not just numbers. Okay, thanks a lot.